What if I told you that women, who were often seen as nothing more than property in ancient Rome, not only survived, but thrived in the bloodiest, most brutal arena in the empire? Imagine stepping into a world where life meant nothing but the next fight, where survival wasn't just a matter of strength but willpower, courage, and sheer grit. The roar of the crowd is deafening, the sands of the arena are stained red, and in the midst of it all stands a woman, armed, ready, and determined. Female gladiators. The very idea may seem impossible to some, but it was a reality in ancient Rome. They were few and far between, but their presence was shocking, controversial, and utterly fascinating. These women weren't just anomalies, they were rebels, warriors, and, in some cases, stars in their own right. But their story has been largely lost to history, buried beneath the glamorization of male gladiators and the myth of what ancient Rome was all about. In this video, we'll dive deep into the hidden world of female gladiators, those women who defied every expectation of their time, fought in the most brutal combat, and left behind stories that still echo today. How did these women rise to power in such a male-dominated world? What drove them to fight to the death for the amusement of others? What made them so terrifying in the arena? These are the questions that have remained unanswered for centuries, but today we'll uncover the mysterious and brutal lives of female gladiators, revealing a history that's as raw, real, and dangerous as the battles they fought. Before we dive into the unique lives of female gladiators, it's essential to understand the world they entered. Gladiatorial combat wasn't just a spectacle, it was a brutal, unforgiving part of ancient Roman life. Gladiators were trained fighters, most often slaves or prisoners of war, who were forced to fight for the entertainment of the Roman public. These battles took place in enormous amphitheaters, the most famous being the Colosseum in Rome, where thousands of spectators would gather to watch bloodshed. Gladiators were not just fighters, they were a symbol of Rome's power, its decadence, and its violent entertainment culture. The games, known as munera, were originally held as a form of funeral rites for the wealthy and powerful, a way to honor the deceased by offering a spectacle that was meant to demonstrate the strength of the Roman people. Over time, these games evolved into massive events held for the public, sometimes lasting for days or even weeks, where gladiators fought not just one-on-one, but in large-scale battles. Male gladiators were the norm, of course, but there was a time when women also stepped into the arena. Female gladiators, referred to as gladiatrices, were rare, but they did exist. And despite the fact that most people thought women were too delicate for such brutal combat, these women took up arms and fought alongside or against their male counterparts. The spectacle of a woman in the arena was a unique blend of fascination and horror, something that broke the cultural norms of the time. While the majority of gladiators were men, female gladiators were often seen as oddities, providing an even greater thrill for the spectators. The combat itself was vicious, with gladiators using a wide variety of weapons and fighting styles. There were swords, spears, tridents, and even nets, each gladiator trained in a specific form of combat depending on their weapon and style. Some were heavily armored, others barely covered at all. The fights were designed to be as brutal and bloody as possible, with the possibility of death always looming over the fighters. While many fights ended in death, others were decided by skill, endurance, or even the mercy of the emperor or the crowd. In the case of female gladiators, the fighting was no different. These women were trained to wield weapons, endure long hours of training, and face the same risks as their male counterparts. Some of them fought to the death, while others fought for fame, fortune, or freedom. The fact that women could even become gladiators in the first place shows how far the boundaries of Roman society were pushed by the gladiatorial games. It wasn't just about survival, it was about making a name for yourself in a world that had no room for women to be warriors. Now that we've set the stage with the basic context of gladiatorial combat, it's time to explore the origins of these female fighters and uncover the stories of their remarkable, if often tragic, lives. The very idea of female gladiators challenges the traditional image of Roman society, where women were typically confined to roles within the home and family. To understand how these women found their way into the arena, we must first look at the cultural and societal norms of ancient Rome. Women were expected to be obedient, modest, and focused on domestic life, so the thought of a woman stepping into the blood-soaked sands of a gladiatorial arena was unthinkable to most. Yet, against all odds, female gladiators existed and even managed to make their mark in history. The first recorded instance of female gladiators dates back to the reign of Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD. In 200 AD, the historian Suetonius documented that Domitian held games in which women participated as gladiators. These women were not fighting for their own personal gain or fame. They were part of a spectacle designed to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. At the time, the idea of women engaging in physical combat was seen as an affront to Roman ideals of femininity and grace, but the emperor's decision to introduce female gladiators was likely a calculated move to shock and entertain the crowds. However, the role of women in gladiatorial combat did not come from the will of the emperor alone. Female gladiators, like their male counterparts, were often slaves or prisoners of war. These women were captured in battle, forced into servitude, and trained in gladiatorial schools known as ludi, the same schools that trained male gladiators. Many were taken from the provinces that Rome had conquered, including the territories around North Africa and Gaul. These women were often seen as spoils of war, used not just as labor, but also as entertainment. It's important to note that the women who became gladiators were rarely ever volunteers. Most were pushed into the arena by circumstance, survival, or the demands of their masters. There were also instances where women willingly entered the gladiatorial world. These were often women from lower social classes or those who were looking for ways to rise in stature, gain fame, or escape their current circumstances. In Roman society, gladiators were famous, and some even achieved celebrity status. For women who had little chance of climbing the social ladder by traditional means, the arena offered a way to achieve wealth, status, and freedom in a way that nothing else could. In many cases, these women fought for their lives, but in other cases, they fought for their own power and autonomy in a world where they were otherwise denied such agency. Despite the rarity of female gladiators, there were enough of them to make an impact on the public imagination. Roman emperors were known for staging extravagant games that often pushed the boundaries of what was socially acceptable. It wasn't just about the physical fight, it was about the spectacle. Having women, who were traditionally considered the gentler, more passive sex, step into the arena and fight to the death was both shocking and titillating for the Roman people. It added a layer of drama and controversy to the games, making them all the more compelling for the audience. The historical record on female gladiators is sparse, and much of what we know about them comes from fragmentary evidence. Ancient texts like those by Suetonius and Juvenal mention female gladiators, though rarely in detail. We know that women fought in some of the most high-profile events, and some even gained recognition for their skill and bravery in combat. For example, a woman named Mevia is known to have fought in the arena and gained attention for her prowess. While there's little else known about her life, her name stands as a symbol of the rare women who fought alongside their male counterparts. It's clear that the origins of female gladiators were deeply intertwined with the cultural fascination with death, violence, and spectacle. These women, whether enslaved or free, took part in a tradition that was both a test of physical endurance and a reflection of Rome's fascination with power, control, and dominance over life and death. For some, it was a brutal way to survive. For others, it was a way to carve out a place in a society that had little respect for their gender. As we continue to uncover the stories of these extraordinary women, we'll delve deeper into their training, their lives, and the impact they had on Roman society. But first, let's take a closer look at how these women were trained and what their lives were really like behind the scenes of the arena. Before a woman could step into the gladiatorial arena, she had to undergo intense, often grueling training. The life of a female gladiator did not begin with the grandeur of the arena, nor with the cheers of the crowds. It began in the harsh, unforgiving world of the ludus, the gladiator school. This was where the real battle began, not just for survival, but for mastery of the skills that would eventually determine whether she lived or died in the arena. The ludus was a brutal place where gladiators, both male and female, were trained to fight. These schools were scattered throughout the Roman Empire, with the most famous one being the Ludus Magnus in Rome itself, located near the Colosseum. It's important to note that while most gladiators were male, women were not excluded from this harsh system. They were trained alongside men, often under the same conditions and with the same instructors. Female gladiators were typically slaves or prisoners of war who were captured by Roman soldiers in battle. They were brought to the ludus to be trained and fought for the amusement of the Roman public. Slaves were seen as disposable property, and their lives were considered less valuable than those of free men. But the women who entered the gladiator schools were forced to undergo the same brutal training routines as their male counterparts. The training was physically demanding, as they had to develop the strength, agility, and combat skills necessary to survive in the arena. The first step in their training was building up their physical strength. Gladiators were subjected to intense workouts that included running, lifting weights, and performing exercises designed to build endurance and stamina. They also learned to fight with various weapons depending on the style they were being trained in. Some female gladiators were trained to use swords, while others learned to wield tridents, nets, or spears. The type of weapon and armor they used depended on their assigned role in the arena. These weapons were not just tools of combat, they were extensions of the gladiator's identity in the arena. One of the most important aspects of training was learning how to fight in formation with other gladiators. Gladiatorial combat wasn't always one-on-one duels. There were often larger, more complex battles in which multiple gladiators fought at once. Female gladiators had to learn how to coordinate their movements with their fellow fighters, how to anticipate their opponent's attacks, and how to respond quickly in the heat of battle. Every move had to be precise and controlled, as one mistake could lead to death. But it wasn't just physical training that made these women formidable fighters. They had to undergo intense mental conditioning as well. The gladiator school was meant to break them down, to strip away any notions of weakness or fear, and to forge them into warriors. Female gladiators, just like their male counterparts, were taught to endure pain and suffering without showing emotion. Their training was not just about becoming skilled fighters. It was about turning them into living weapons, able to withstand the most brutal of combat scenarios. For women who entered the arena, it wasn't just about the thrill of battle, it was a matter of survival. Many of these women had no choice but to fight, either because they were slaves or because they were criminals condemned to the arena. For these women, the ludus was a place where they had no rights, no voice, and no chance of escape. Yet, some women thrived in this brutal system. Despite the hardship, many became skilled fighters, and some even earned the respect of their peers. In addition to the physical and mental training, female gladiators were also taught the art of public performance. The games were not just about fighting, they were about entertainment. Gladiators, whether male or female, had to perform for the crowd. They had to put on a show, both in the way they fought and in the way they carried themselves in the arena. There were gladiators who specialized in dramatic flourishes, theatrics, and showmanship, and female gladiators were no exception. Some would wear elaborate costumes, while others would be adorned in minimal armor to emphasize their skill and strength. Their role in the arena was as much about spectacle as it was about survival. While training was difficult for all gladiators, it was particularly challenging for women. They had to prove themselves in a male-dominated world where women were expected to stay out of the public eye, let alone engage in violent combat. But for those who entered the arena, the fight was not just for victory, it was for recognition. The courage it took for these women to face the crowd and step into the ring with male gladiators was unparalleled. They had to push against the societal norms of their time, where women were seen as fragile and incapable of such fierce competition. For some women, gladiatorial combat was a way to escape the harsh realities of slavery or poverty. While their lives were controlled by their masters or the state, the arena represented a chance for fame, wealth, and, in some cases, freedom. If a female gladiator performed well enough, she could earn her freedom or gain the favor of a powerful patron. However, the dangers of the arena were always present. Many women didn't make it out alive. Even if they survived the battles, they were often left with physical and psychological scars that stayed with them for life. The training of female gladiators was a fascinating contradiction. These women were trained to be killers, yet they were often viewed with a mix of fascination and revulsion. In an empire where power and dominance were defined by violence, the women who fought in the arena stood as both symbols of rebellion and evidence of how deeply entrenched violence was in Roman society. As we delve further into the lives of these women, we begin to see that their stories were not just about battle. They were about resilience, survival, and defying the limitations placed on them by a society that viewed them as lesser beings. But their battles were not just physical. They were also fought on the grounds of identity, gender, and power. The social status of female gladiators in ancient Rome was a complex and multifaceted issue. On one hand, they were some of the lowest in society, slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war who had little to no rights. On the other hand, some of them were able to gain fame, recognition, and even a degree of respect for their strength, skill, and courage in the arena. To fully understand the social standing of female gladiators, we must first take a closer look at their role in the wider social fabric of Roman life. At the most basic level, the majority of female gladiators were slaves or criminals. In ancient Rome, slaves were considered property, nothing more than tools to be used, bought, and sold. They had no rights and no freedom, and their lives were controlled entirely by their masters. Many of the female gladiators who entered the arena were women who had been captured in war or condemned for crimes. These women were often sold to ludi, gladiator schools, where they were trained and forced to fight. For these women, the arena was not a place of glory or fame, but a brutal reality where survival was the only goal. However, while many of these women were slaves, not all were. Some women entered the gladiatorial world voluntarily. These women were usually from the lower echelons of Roman society, and for them, becoming a gladiator offered a chance at fame, fortune, and a certain degree of autonomy. Gladiators, whether male or female, were public figures. They were celebrities, known across the empire for their bravery, skill, and strength. While most of these women would never be free from the status of their birth, becoming a gladiator provided them with an opportunity to achieve a level of recognition that few other women could attain. The fame that came with being a gladiator was not always something to be proud of, though. Female gladiators were often seen as curiosities, objects of fascination for the crowds who attended the games. The presence of a woman in the arena was shocking to the Roman public, and many of the spectators viewed female gladiators as something to be feared and admired. These women were often viewed as both symbols of defiance and a violation of Roman ideals of femininity. The Roman world was deeply patriarchal. Women were expected to be obedient, modest, and focused on domestic responsibilities. The idea of a woman engaging in violent combat was a direct challenge to these gender norms. Female gladiators were not only defying Roman conventions about women's roles, they were also challenging the power structures that controlled them. They fought not just for their lives, but to carve out a place for themselves in a world that had no room for female warriors. Despite the unusual nature of their participation in gladiatorial games, some female gladiators were able to gain recognition and respect. They were often revered for their courage, strength, and skill in the arena. In some cases, these women became celebrities in their own right, celebrated for their ability to face down death and fight with the same intensity as their male counterparts. Roman emperors, who were known for their lavish and extravagant displays, sometimes used these women as part of their political campaigns. Female gladiators were used as tools of entertainment and propaganda, showcasing the emperor's power to command both life and death. Their inclusion in the games added an exotic element that appealed to the masses, and some female gladiators even gained sponsorships from powerful men who hoped to use them as a way to increase their own social standing. In some cases, female gladiators were given the chance to gain their freedom. If they fought well enough and earned the crowd's favor, they could potentially win their release from slavery. Freedom was a powerful motivator for some gladiators, and female fighters were no exception. A victorious gladiator could win money, land, and even the right to live as a free person. However, this was not the norm. Most female gladiators who survived the arena either remained slaves or were killed in battle. The rare exceptions were celebrated in ancient texts, but their stories were often lost to history. Women who entered the gladiatorial world had to contend with more than just physical dangers. They also faced the social stigma of being seen as unladylike or immoral. Roman women were expected to uphold virtues such as chastity, modesty, and piety, qualities that were diametrically opposed to the violence and brutality of the arena. Female gladiators were often considered to be morally corrupt, their actions seen as a violation of the natural order. They were viewed as outside the boundaries of acceptable Roman womanhood. At the same time, there was a certain fascination with these women. Their presence in the arena, where they fought with fierce abandon and skill, made them stand out from the typical image of women in Roman society. Gladiators, male and female, were celebrities in their own right, known for their bravery and athleticism. While society might have rejected them in other aspects of life, in the arena they were acknowledged for their strength and courage. In addition to their role in the games, female gladiators were often used as symbols of rebellion. They represented the idea that women were capable of more than what society allowed them to be. While the majority of women in ancient Rome were relegated to domestic roles, these fighters showed that women could stand toe-to-toe with men in the most dangerous and violent of arenas. They were an anomaly in a world where women were generally expected to be seen and not heard, obeying the commands of their fathers, husbands, and masters. The presence of female gladiators in the arena was a direct challenge to these expectations. Yet, despite their occasional fame and admiration, female gladiators were still ultimately marginalized. They were seen as outcasts, their lives dictated by the whims of their masters and the demands of the crowd. While some gained freedom or achieved celebrity status, most were left with little to show for their battles except scars, both physical and emotional, that would last a lifetime. The status of female gladiators was complex. They existed in a world that both celebrated and rejected them, admired and feared them, revered and degraded them. Their role in Roman society was small but significant, and their stories continue to captivate our imagination today. These women fought not just for survival, but for a place in history, challenging the norms of their time and creating a legacy that would be nearly forgotten. Until now. When female gladiators stepped into the arena, they were not just warriors. They were part of a larger, carefully constructed spectacle designed to entertain, shock, and awe the Roman masses. The games were not just about combat, they were about pageantry, performance, and drama. Gladiators, including women, were the stars of these grand events, and the role they played went far beyond the physical fight. Their presence in the arena was as much about spectacle as it was about survival. The gladiatorial games in ancient Rome were a form of public entertainment that often featured more than just combat. These events were carefully staged and produced, much like modern-day performances. The battles were meant to elicit strong reactions from the audience: fear, excitement, and awe. Gladiators, whether male or female, were the performers in this brutal theater. Every fight was part of a larger narrative, each gladiator playing a role in the larger story of the games. Female gladiators were an integral part of this spectacle. Their participation in the games was a rare and exotic element that added an extra layer of drama to the events. In a society where women were expected to be passive and obedient, the sight of a woman taking up arms and fighting to the death was both shocking and captivating for the Roman audience. Female gladiators were often used to break the monotony of the traditional male gladiator battles. They were an anomaly, something that defied the social norms of the time, and their inclusion in the games was meant to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. In some cases, female gladiators were portrayed as mythical or exotic figures, representing the idea of a warrior woman who existed outside the norms of society. These women were often given dramatic names, costumes, and personas that emphasized their uniqueness. Some were dressed in armor that made them appear almost like goddesses, while others were presented as fierce and wild warriors, their clothing minimal to highlight their physical prowess. These women were part of the larger theatrical performance of the games, and their fights were staged to entertain the crowd as much as to test their skill. The battles in which female gladiators participated were not always traditional one-on-one duels. Sometimes they were involved in larger, more elaborate spectacles that included multiple fighters, or even mock naval battles. These events were designed to showcase not just the combatants' skills, but the emperor's wealth and power. Female gladiators were sometimes part of these grand spectacles, fighting in teams or against dangerous animals, adding an exotic flair to the already dramatic events. In some cases, female gladiators were pitted against wild animals, another key element of the Roman games. These animals, such as lions, bears, and tigers, were used as a way to demonstrate the power of the emperor and the cruelty of the Roman entertainment system. Female gladiators, like their male counterparts, were forced to fight these beasts in life-or-death combat, and their survival was often seen as a testament to their bravery and skill. In the rare cases where female gladiators were victorious, their accomplishments were celebrated as feats of extraordinary courage. The use of female gladiators in these spectacles wasn't just about bloodshed, it was about creating a spectacle that the crowd could not forget. The drama of a woman fighting to the death against all odds in a world that expected her to be submissive was a powerful narrative that captivated the Roman people. The crowd's reaction to female gladiators was often mixed. Some spectators were appalled by the idea of women in the arena, while others were thrilled by the novelty of it. Regardless of the audience's reaction, the presence of female gladiators added a new dimension to the gladiatorial games, making them even more dramatic and exciting. In the arena, female gladiators were often treated as objects of both fascination and revulsion. Their bodies were put on display for the amusement of the Roman public, and their every move was scrutinized. The Roman audience had a complicated relationship with female gladiators. On one hand, these women were admired for their bravery and strength. On the other hand, they were seen as transgressing the boundaries of Roman femininity. Female gladiators were both celebrated and shamed, revered, and feared, and their participation in the games made them larger-than-life figures in the eyes of the public. But despite their role in these grand spectacles, the lives of female gladiators were far from glamorous. For most of these women, the games were a brutal reality where survival was never guaranteed. Even if a female gladiator won a battle, there was no promise of freedom or a better life. Most gladiators, regardless of gender, were doomed to live in captivity, constantly fighting for their lives. While some of these women gained fame and recognition for their skill, others were forgotten, their names lost to history. The role of female gladiators in the spectacles of ancient Rome was a complex one. They were both performers and fighters, taking part in a violent and dangerous form of entertainment that captivated the Roman masses. Their participation in the games added an exotic and shocking element to the already thrilling battles, making them an integral part of the gladiatorial tradition. While the gladiatorial games themselves have long since faded into history, the stories of these women, warriors who defied their gender and fought for survival, still captivate us today. While the names of most female gladiators have been lost to history, there are a few who stand out as iconic figures, their exploits providing a glimpse into the lives of these fierce women. These gladiatrices were the ones who defied the expectations of their time and fought not only for their survival, but also for a place in the annals of Roman history. Their stories, while scarce, reveal the power, bravery, and complexity of female gladiators and offer insight into the ways in which they were both celebrated and marginalized by society. One of the most famous female gladiators was Mavia, whose name has survived in the fragmented historical record. She is often cited as an example of the few women who fought in the arena and gained recognition for their skills. Mavia was a well-known figure in the gladiatorial games, and her name was often associated with bravery and mastery in combat. Mavia's fame, however, was not only due to her skill in the arena, but also because of the extraordinary nature of her participation in a male-dominated world. It is said that she fought with the same intensity and ferocity as her male counterparts, earning the admiration of the crowds and the respect of her fellow gladiators. Mavia's participation in the games exemplifies the idea that female gladiators, while rare, were certainly not unheard of. The fact that she was mentioned in historical sources indicates that she achieved a level of fame and recognition that would have been difficult for most women in ancient Rome to attain. Her story, though limited in details, demonstrates the remarkable journey these women undertook, stepping into an arena where death and survival hung in the balance, and where skill and bravery could make them legends. Another notable figure was Achillea, who was part of a group of female gladiators said to have fought during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. Achillea, like Mavia, was a symbol of defiance and strength in a society that reserved combat and physical violence for men. Her name, too, has survived in the historical record, though only through fragmented texts. It's said that Achillea was a seasoned gladiator who participated in several high-profile events, showing exceptional skill with her weapons and gaining significant fame in the process. The participation of female gladiators like Achillea and Mavia was considered a spectacle, an exotic addition to the bloody battles that made up the gladiatorial games. But these women were not just curiosities. They were skilled warriors, each of whom fought with determination, discipline, and an understanding of the stakes they faced. The challenges these women faced in the arena were not unlike those faced by their male counterparts. However, the fact that they were women made their victories and survival even more noteworthy. They stood as symbols of strength, courage, and resistance to societal expectations of gender roles. In addition to these figures, there are references to other unnamed female gladiators who fought in the arenas across the Roman Empire. Historical texts, such as the writings of Suetonius, mention the occasional female gladiator, though details about their individual exploits are often scant. What is clear, however, is that their presence in the arena was impactful enough to be recorded in the annals of Roman history. These women's contributions to the gladiatorial games were more than just a form of entertainment. They were a reflection of the fluidity of power and the ways in which Roman society was willing to break with tradition to cater to the desires of the public. The most famous battles involving female gladiators were often staged events meant to provide a spectacle for the crowds. But these battles were also real life and death contests. Female gladiators were sometimes pitted against one another, their skill tested in one-on-one duels. In some cases, they were set to fight against wild animals such as lions, tigers, and bears. These events were designed to show the strength and bravery of the gladiators, but they were also a means of demonstrating the emperor's power and control over life and death. While female gladiators were fewer in number than their male counterparts, their battles often gained the attention of the public and the emperor. The audience's reaction to these women was often a mix of awe and repulsion. On one hand, there was a fascination with women engaging in such brutal and violent acts. On the other hand, there was a sense of discomfort. After all, Roman women were not supposed to be warriors. This tension added an extra layer of drama and complexity to the performances of female gladiators, making their fights even more compelling for the spectators. Despite the limited information available, we can infer that female gladiators, like their male counterparts, had to fight for recognition. Some won their freedom, others gained fame and wealth, while many were killed or left to languish in obscurity. But for those who rose to prominence, like Mevia and Aquileia, their stories have become part of the broader narrative of the gladiatorial games, providing a glimpse into the lives of the women who dared to step into the arena. While the names of most female gladiators have been lost to time, their contributions to the world of gladiatorial combat should not be forgotten. These women fought in a world that was not built for them, and their courage, strength, and skill continue to resonate with us today. The limited but important references to these female warriors serve as a reminder that history is not just made by kings and emperors, but by those who dared to challenge the system, break the rules, and fight for their place in a society that tried to silence them. The gladiatorial arena was a place where survival was never guaranteed, and the brutality of the contests was something that both spectators and fighters had to come to terms with. For female gladiators, the challenges they faced in the arena were immense, not just in terms of physical endurance, but also in the psychological toll of fighting for their lives in front of a bloodthirsty crowd. The violence of the arena was the defining characteristic of gladiatorial combat, and it was here that female gladiators had to prove their worth, often against overwhelming odds. The primary purpose of the games was to entertain the public, and the brutality of the combat was a central part of that entertainment. The Roman populace flocked to the amphitheaters to witness death, bloodshed, and violence, and the more brutal and bloody the fight, the more thrilling it was to the crowd. Gladiators, regardless of gender, were pitted against each other in life or death battles. For most of them, the fight was not just about winning, it was about surviving. Female gladiators, like their male counterparts, fought in various types of battles. The most common form of combat was one-on-one duels, where two gladiators faced off in a fight to the death. These duels could last for several minutes or even longer, depending on the skill and stamina of the combatants. The weapons used in these battles were often heavy and dangerous, designed to cause maximum damage. Swords, tridents, spears, and axes were common, and many gladiators also fought with shields, armor, and helmets. The female gladiators were just as likely to use these weapons as the men, but their smaller size and different physical capabilities meant they had to fight with a different strategy. In some cases, female gladiators were pitted against wild animals, such as lions or tigers. These fights were even more dangerous than the typical gladiatorial combat, as the animals were unpredictable and far stronger than any human fighter. The idea of a woman fighting a wild beast was a spectacle that drew immense attention, and the Roman crowds reveled in the ferocity and danger of these fights. The animals were often released into the arena without any prior training, making them more aggressive and difficult to control. For female gladiators, facing such beasts was a true test of their skill and bravery. Few survived these encounters, and even those who did were left with deep psychological and physical scars. The violence in the arena wasn't limited to just the fights between gladiators or between gladiators and animals. There were also elaborate mock battles and reenactments, which sometimes involved more than a dozen fighters at once. These were designed to show off the emperor's wealth and the grandeur of Roman power. But they also added to the brutality of the events, as gladiators were often forced to fight for hours without rest. These extended engagements were exhausting, both mentally and physically. Female gladiators, just like the men, had to endure the pain and fatigue that came with these long battles, often in front of a crowd that demanded more and more blood. One of the most terrifying aspects of gladiatorial combat was the possibility of death. While not all battles ended in fatalities, many did. The crowd and the emperor could decide whether to show mercy to a defeated gladiator, but the decision was often arbitrary. A gladiator who was seriously injured might be spared if the crowd demanded it, or they might be killed on the spot if the emperor gave the signal. For female gladiators, death was always a looming possibility. While some women may have survived many battles and earned their freedom, many others perished in the arena, their lives snuffed out by the sword or the claws of a wild beast. The brutal nature of these games left no room for weakness or hesitation. The female gladiators had to be ready to face death at any moment. The psychological toll of fighting in the arena was also immense. Gladiators had to be mentally prepared to face the possibility of death every time they stepped into the ring. The physical pain was excruciating, but the mental strain was just as severe. The pressure to survive, to impress the crowd, and to win the favor of the emperor or the audience was constant. Female gladiators, like their male counterparts, had to deal with the fear, the anxiety, and the uncertainty of each battle. In some cases, the gladiators were trained to suppress their emotions and to fight without showing fear or pain. This psychological conditioning was meant to make them more effective in combat, but it also made them emotionally numb, capable of facing death without flinching. The arena was a place where violence was not just accepted, it was expected. The spectators were there to witness bloodshed, to see gladiators battle to the death. And for female gladiators, this was a constant reality. Every time they stepped into the arena, they risked their lives, not just for survival, but for the entertainment of the Roman masses. The brutality of the arena was an integral part of the gladiatorial games, and for the women who participated, it was something they had to confront head-on. For some female gladiators, the violence of the arena was a necessary evil, something they had to endure in order to gain their freedom, their fame, or their survival. But for others, the brutal nature of the games was a constant reminder of their subjugation. They were fighting not just for their lives, but against a system that viewed them as expendable objects. The fact that these women were willing to face such brutality speaks to their extraordinary courage, and the legacy of their fights lives on today as a testament to their strength, resilience, and determination. The presence of female gladiators in the Roman arena was not just a matter of sport or entertainment, it was deeply intertwined with the politics of the time. Emperors, politicians, and the ruling elite often used gladiatorial games as a means of asserting power, manipulating public opinion, and solidifying their hold on the populace. The decision to feature women in these spectacles was a deliberate one, designed to achieve specific political goals, whether to demonstrate the emperor's wealth, entertain the masses, or send a message of dominance and control. Gladiatorial games were often used as a tool for political propaganda. Roman emperors, particularly during the height of the empire, were known for their lavish displays of wealth and power. The games were an opportunity to show the people of Rome and the entire empire the emperor's ability to command life and death. By sponsoring grand spectacles which included gladiatorial battles, mock naval engagements, and wild animal hunts, emperors could solidify their authority and earn the favor of the masses. The games were a way to keep the population entertained, but they also served a far more strategic purpose: to distract the public from the political realities of the empire. The inclusion of female gladiators in these events was a particularly potent political tool. Women fighting in the arena were a shocking spectacle in a world where women were expected to be meek, modest, and confined to the private sphere. Their presence in the gladiatorial games was a direct challenge to traditional Roman gender norms, and by incorporating women into the games, emperors were able to further captivate and control the public's imagination. It was a statement, an assertion of power that transcended the physical and cultural boundaries of the time. Emperors like Domitian and Commodus were particularly known for their extravagant use of gladiatorial games to enhance their political standing. Domitian, in particular, is credited with introducing female gladiators into the arena. His decision to include women was part of a larger effort to make his games more spectacular and exotic, giving the crowd something new to marvel at. Women gladiators were seen as rare and exotic creatures, almost like mythological figures who defied the natural order. Their presence in the arena added an element of intrigue and tension, heightening the drama of the games and reinforcing Domitian's status as a ruler who could command both life and death. The role of female gladiators in the games was also tied to the emperor's need to demonstrate his ability to maintain control over both life and death. In Roman society, the emperor was seen as the ultimate authority, the one who had the power to decide who lived and who died. By orchestrating these violent spectacles, where both men and women fought to the death, the emperor reinforced his role as a supreme figure of authority. The gladiatorial games were a symbol of the emperor's power over life and death, and the inclusion of women in the games served to underscore this point. Women gladiators were often seen as expendable, as objects to be used for entertainment, and their participation was a reminder of the emperor's absolute control over every aspect of life in the empire. But beyond this, female gladiators also represented a more complex aspect of Roman politics. Their inclusion in the games was a political statement about the power and resilience of women in a society that largely marginalized them. Female gladiators were often portrayed as rebels, women who refused to conform to the roles society had set for them. They were the ultimate symbol of defiance, stepping into a space reserved for men and facing the very real possibility of death for the amusement of the crowd. In this way, female gladiators served as a metaphor for the broader struggles of women in Roman society, even as their participation in the games ultimately reinforced the patriarchal power structures that existed in the empire. At times, female gladiators were also used to symbolize the wild and uncivilized nature of the provinces conquered by Rome. Just as gladiators themselves were often prisoners of war, the women who became gladiators were frequently captured from the barbarian territories of the empire. By pitting these women against Roman-trained fighters, the emperor was making a point about the superiority of Roman civilization. These women, representing the conquered peoples, were forced to fight to the death in the arena, embodying the empire's power over its subjects. While it is clear that female gladiators were primarily used as a form of political spectacle, their involvement in the arena was not always solely for the emperor's benefit. Some women may have entered the gladiatorial world for personal reasons, whether to gain fame, fortune, or freedom. For these women, the political aspect of the games might not have been as significant as the chance to prove themselves in a brutal and unforgiving world. However, even these women, who may have seen the games as a way to escape the limitations of Roman society, were still being used as pawns in a larger political game. The crowd's reaction to female gladiators was an essential part of the political spectacle. Emperors knew that the public's admiration for these women, combined with their shock and awe, would help solidify their own power. Female gladiators were often treated as symbols of the emperor's generosity or ruthlessness. If they were victorious, they might be rewarded with freedom or riches, and their victory was seen as a reflection of the emperor's power. If they were defeated, their death was a reminder of the emperor's ultimate control. In either case, the presence of these women in the arena worked to reinforce the emperor's narrative of dominance and authority. The political use of female gladiators was not without its consequences. These women were, at best, pawns in a larger game of power. They were often slaves or prisoners, with little agency in their own lives. While they may have gained fame or even earned their freedom through their participation in the games, their role in Roman society was still defined by their subjugation. The political exploitation of these women was a stark reminder of the inequality that existed in the Roman Empire, where those who held power could manipulate the lives of others for their own gain. The inclusion of female gladiators in the games is, therefore, not just a fascinating footnote in the history of ancient Rome. It is a powerful symbol of how politics, power, and gender intersected in a society that valued spectacle above all else. These women were both objects of fascination and instruments of power. Their participation in the gladiatorial games speaks to the complexities of Roman politics, where violence, control, and entertainment were intricately intertwined. The brutal and dramatic presence of female gladiators in the arena was short-lived. As much as they captivated the crowds and became part of the spectacle that defined Roman entertainment, their existence in the gladiatorial games gradually faded. The decline of female gladiators can be attributed to a combination of changing social, political, and religious factors, all of which eventually led to the near-total disappearance of women from the blood-soaked sands of the Roman amphitheaters. One of the main reasons for the decline of female gladiators was the gradual shift in Roman attitudes towards gladiatorial combat. As the Roman Empire expanded, gladiatorial games became increasingly popular, but they also began to attract criticism from various quarters. The rise of Christianity in the 4th century AD had a profound effect on Roman culture and its values. Christianity, with its emphasis on compassion, mercy, and the sanctity of life, came into direct conflict with the bloodthirsty nature of the gladiatorial games. By the time of Emperor Constantine's reign in the early 4th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion in the empire, and the gladiatorial games were increasingly seen as barbaric and incompatible with Christian teachings. As Christianity spread across the empire, the Church began to exert more influence over Roman social and cultural life. Gladiatorial combat was increasingly viewed as morally reprehensible, and the Church condemned it as a form of sinful entertainment. The concept of the arena, once a symbol of Roman strength and entertainment, became a symbol of cruelty and violence in the eyes of many Christians. The Church's teachings on the sanctity of life and the inherent dignity of every person stood in stark contrast to the brutal spectacles that took place in the amphitheaters, leading to the eventual banning of gladiatorial games in the early 5th century AD. While the rise of Christianity played a major role in the decline of the gladiatorial games, it was not the only factor. The political and economic realities of the empire also contributed to the end of the games. As the empire faced increasing pressure from barbarian invasions and internal strife, The resources required to maintain the extravagant games became less available. Emperors who once used the games as a way to gain popularity and control over the populace began to focus on other methods of securing their power. The gladiatorial games, once a tool of political control, became increasingly costly and less politically effective. The final blow to the tradition of gladiatorial combat came in 404 AD, when Emperor Honorius officially banned the games. This was the culmination of a long process of decline, but it marked the end of an era that had lasted for centuries. With the games prohibited, the practice of gladiatorial combat, and by extension the role of female gladiators, was abolished. The decline of the games was part of a broader transformation in Roman society as the empire grappled with its changing political, social, and religious landscape. However, the stories of female gladiators did not completely disappear. While the gladiatorial games themselves were banned, the fascination with these fierce women endured. Their stories were passed down through the centuries, albeit in fragments. Historians, writers, and artists continued to reference the existence of female gladiators, even if the specifics of their lives were often obscured by time. The legacy of these women, though largely forgotten in the mainstream narrative of Roman history, lived on in popular culture and in the collective memory of those who were drawn to the spectacle of the arena. It's important to recognize that while female gladiators disappeared from the arena, the social implications of their existence did not vanish. The idea of women participating in combat, of defying the norms of their gender, and of achieving fame and recognition in a violent male-dominated world left an indelible mark on history. Their role in the gladiatorial games remains a symbol of resistance, strength, and the complexities of power, gender, and social order in ancient Rome. As the centuries passed, the image of the female gladiator became a symbol of rebellion and strength, celebrated in literature, film, and other forms of entertainment. While we may never know the full extent of their stories, the legacy of female gladiators endures in the stories we tell today, stories of women who stepped outside the boundaries set for them and faced down the greatest challenge of all, the arena. The world of female gladiators has been shrouded in mystery for centuries, and much of what we know is based on a combination of historical fragments, myths, and speculation. The fascinating and brutal reality of these women's lives has been obscured by time, leaving behind a collection of myths and legends that blur the line between fact and fiction. As we dive into the history of female gladiators, it's important to distinguish between what we can confirm and what has been exaggerated or misrepresented by subsequent generations. The myths of female gladiators. One of the most enduring myths about female gladiators is that they were exotic, powerful women, often depicted as fierce warriors, almost like Amazons, who fought for fame and glory. Modern portrayals in books, movies, and television shows frequently exaggerate their roles, turning them into heroic figures who challenge the status quo and fight for freedom, often with little regard for the brutal realities of their lives. This myth paints a picture of these women as champions, adored by crowds, revered as warriors who broke the mold of Roman femininity. But in truth, female gladiators were often not fighting for glory. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals, compelled to fight against their will. The idea that female gladiators were celebrated as cultural icons in their own time is far removed from the harsh reality of their existence. For many, their participation in the games was not about heroism, but about survival, fighting simply because they had no choice. Another myth is that female gladiators were given special treatment or afforded certain privileges because of their gender. In reality, they were often subjected to the same brutal training and expectations as their male counterparts. They fought with the same weapons, faced the same dangers, and endured the same grueling physical and mental conditioning. While some female gladiators may have gained some fame or recognition, they were still primarily viewed as curiosities, objects of spectacle, rather than heroes. The myth that they enjoyed equal footing in the arena with their male counterparts is misleading. The idea of female gladiators being romantically or sexually empowered figures is also a modern construction, often applied to characters in contemporary fiction. In ancient Rome, the primary value of a gladiator, whether male or female, was their ability to fight. Gladiators, especially women, were seen as less than human by society at large, and their involvement in the games was more about subjugation and exploitation than empowerment. The reality of female gladiators. The truth is far more complicated and, in many ways, much darker. Female gladiators were an anomaly in Roman society, not by choice, but by circumstance. Most of them were slaves or prisoners, their lives determined by forces beyond their control. They were owned by their masters, who would profit from their participation in the games. The brutality they faced in the arena was a reflection of their social status. They were expendable, treated as commodities to entertain the masses. Historically, the exact number of female gladiators is difficult to determine. While references to women in the arena exist, they are often vague, and there is no clear record of how many actually fought. What we do know is that women were present in the gladiatorial games, but their participation was rare compared to their male counterparts. Female gladiators were usually considered a novelty, added to the games for the shock value of seeing women engage in violent, bloody combat. One of the few historical sources that mentions female gladiators comes from the historian Suetonius, who documented Emperor Domitian's decision to include women in the gladiatorial games around 81 to 96 AD. His reign is the most commonly associated with the rise of female gladiators, although it's clear that their inclusion was not widespread and was more of an exception than the rule. Suetonius's mention of female gladiators is brief, and most of what we know about them is inferred from these scant references. Other sources, including the poet Juvenal, provide additional hints, but these are often more focused on criticizing the degeneracy of Roman society than on documenting the lives of the women who fought in the arena. The physical toll on female gladiators was immense. Like their male counterparts, they were trained to fight with deadly weapons, often under harsh conditions, and they had to endure the constant threat of death in the arena. Training involved extensive physical conditioning, with gladiators subjected to brutal exercises that tested their endurance, strength, and mental fortitude. For female gladiators, there was little room for weakness. They were expected to fight with the same intensity and brutality as the men, and their survival depended on their ability to perform in a world that saw them as expendable. Despite the myths that romanticize the role of female gladiators, it's clear that their lives were defined by violence, control, and exploitation. They were not fighting for justice or freedom, but simply for survival, fighting in a system that had no regard for their humanity. Most of these women were not immortalized as great warriors. They were simply part of a cruel entertainment system that offered them no choice but to fight. The most notable female gladiators, such as Mevia and Aquilia, may have achieved some fame during their time, but their stories were mostly lost to history. The records of their existence are minimal and incomplete, and their lives remain shrouded in mystery. What we do know about these women comes from fragmented sources that were written by male historians who often had little interest in the lives of women gladiators. As a result, their stories have been overshadowed by the more celebrated accounts of male gladiators and emperors. What we don't know. Despite the historical references, much about the lives of female gladiators remains a mystery. The lack of detailed records means that we can only speculate about their personal experiences. Did they form relationships with one another in the ludi, gladiator schools? Were there instances of gladiator women who managed to escape and gain their freedom? How did they cope with the psychological trauma of constant combat, and did they ever find any way to resist their exploitation? Additionally, we have no way of knowing how widespread female gladiators really were. Were they limited to certain regions or emperors who favored such spectacles? How many women were forced into gladiatorial combat against their will, and how many entered the arena voluntarily? These questions remain unanswered because the historical record is incomplete, and much of what we do know comes from biased sources that were more concerned with the sensational aspects of the games than with the actual lives of the women who fought in them. Although female gladiators disappeared from the arena over a millennium ago, their legacy has lived on through the centuries. Today, the idea of women fighting in the gladiatorial games captures the imagination of many, and their stories, though fragmented, continue to fascinate us. These women, once relegated to the margins of history, have been resurrected in modern culture, becoming symbols of defiance, strength, and rebellion against oppressive norms. The enduring fascination with female gladiators. The fascination with female gladiators has never truly faded. The idea of women participating in one of the most brutal and dangerous forms of entertainment is a compelling concept that challenges traditional gender roles. In a society where women were typically seen as weak, passive, and domestic, the existence of female gladiators symbolizes rebellion and empowerment. The very notion that these women could step into the arena, fight for their lives, and sometimes even gain fame and respect is a story that resonates with modern notions of gender equality and female empowerment. Over time, this fascination has translated into popular culture, where female gladiators have appeared in movies, books, television shows, and comics. These modern portrayals often blur the line between historical fact and fiction, but they reflect society's ongoing interest in these warrior women. Films like Gladiator 2000 and television shows like Spartacus 2010 have depicted female gladiators as strong, skilled, and defiant women who challenge the patriarchal systems of their time. While these depictions are often fictionalized and romanticized, they highlight the enduring legacy of these women as symbols of resistance and power. In many of these portrayals, female gladiators are presented as fighters who not only defy the expectations of their gender, but also fight for personal freedom, justice, and a chance to break away from oppressive systems. The modern interpretation often emphasizes their emotional journey, fighting not just for survival, but for a sense of autonomy and identity. These stories provide a more empowering narrative than the harsh reality of the original female gladiators, where survival was the only goal. Feminism and the reclamation of history. The legacy of female gladiators has also been reclaimed by modern feminists who view these women as early symbols of female strength and resilience. In the context of the fight for women's rights and equality, female gladiators represent a historical precedent for women who refuse to conform to traditional gender roles. These women didn't just fight for sport, they fought for their lives, often against impossible odds. For modern feminists, the story of female gladiators challenges the notion that women are inherently weaker or less capable than men. It shows that women, even in one of the most patriarchal societies in history, were willing to stand up and fight for something greater than themselves. In this way, the legacy of female gladiators has been transformed. No longer are they merely spectacles of ancient cruelty, but they are celebrated as symbols of power, resilience, and defiance. Their involvement in the gladiatorial games was a form of resistance to the rigid social structures that sought to keep them oppressed. As feminist scholars continue to reclaim forgotten histories, the stories of these warrior women become important symbols in the ongoing battle for gender equality. Female gladiators in modern media. One of the most prominent ways that the legacy of female gladiators has lived on is through modern media. While historical accuracy may be sacrificed for the sake of drama or entertainment, female gladiators continue to appear in stories that explore themes of survival, resistance, and breaking free from societal constraints. In Spartacus, a popular television series set in ancient Rome, the character of Sura represents the brutal life that a female gladiator might have led. While the show's depiction is highly fictionalized, it does tap into the emotional and physical suffering of women in the arena. The character's journey is one of strength, survival, and ultimately, vengeance. In this series, female gladiators are depicted not as mere curiosities or objects of spectacle, but as fully fleshed-out characters who have their own desires, dreams, and struggles. Movies like Gladiator 2000, though focused primarily on the story of a male gladiator, also include female characters like Lucilla, who embody strength and resistance within a deeply patriarchal society. Although she is not a gladiator herself, her presence in the story and her involvement in political intrigue add depth to the concept of women fighting for power in a world controlled by men. This shows how the legacy of female gladiators has been expanded in modern cinema, adding layers of complexity to their role in the gladiatorial world. Comics and graphic novels have also explored the lives of female gladiators, often mixing historical fiction with elements of fantasy. Female gladiators in these genres are often depicted as powerful and fearless warriors, reflecting the idealized version of these women that modern culture has created. These portrayals allow us to imagine a world in which women were given more agency and power in the arena, a narrative that resonates with contemporary themes of female empowerment. The reinterpretation of ancient history. Modern scholars and historians are also increasingly interested in the stories of female gladiators. While much of what we know about them comes from fragmentary sources, historians have begun to examine the role of women in ancient Roman society in a more nuanced way. Instead of seeing female gladiators as mere anomalies, scholars are exploring how these women fit into the broader context of Roman life. Were they victims of the system, or were they agents of their own fate, using their participation in the games as a way to gain power or escape from their circumstances? These are questions that continue to be explored as we re-examine the ancient world through a more modern lens. The rediscovery of female gladiators also raises important questions about the way history has been told. The lives of women, especially those on the fringes of society, have often been overlooked or marginalized. By uncovering the stories of female gladiators, we are able to recognize the complexity of their experiences and the agency they exhibited in a world that denied them many of the freedoms enjoyed by their male counterparts. In doing so, we challenge the traditional narrative of ancient history, giving voice to those who were silenced by time. Female gladiators and modern-day parallels. The legacy of female gladiators also resonates in today's world, where women continue to fight for equality, recognition, and a place in arenas that were once dominated by men. While the context has changed, the battle for equality in competitive fields, whether in sports, politics, or business, mirrors the struggles of these ancient warriors. Women today are still fighting for their place in the public sphere, challenging systems of power and fighting to be seen as equals to men. Modern combat sports such as boxing, MMA, and wrestling feature female athletes who, like their ancient counterparts, engage in physical combat for both entertainment and personal achievement. These women, much like the gladiators of old, face not only physical challenges, but societal scrutiny as they push against gender norms. Their struggles for respect and recognition echo the experiences of the female gladiators who fought in ancient Rome. In modern times, the concept of the female gladiator has become a powerful symbol for the feminist movement, but this symbol is often clouded by myth. The allure of female gladiators, strong, independent, and defiant, fits perfectly with the narratives of modern feminism, which celebrates women breaking free from societal restrictions. However, the reality of these ancient women's lives was far more complicated and fraught with suffering, control, and exploitation. As a result, the glorification of the female gladiator in modern feminist discourse requires careful consideration of both the empowering and troubling aspects of their stories. The romanticization of female gladiators. One of the key aspects of the myth surrounding female gladiators is their romanticized portrayal in popular media and feminist narratives. In contemporary books, films, and television shows, female gladiators are often depicted as heroic figures, independent women who fight for their freedom and against societal constraints. These portrayals focus on themes of empowerment, strength, and resistance, turning the female gladiator into a feminist icon who defies the patriarchal systems of her time. While there is nothing inherently wrong with using these women as symbols of empowerment, this romanticized view oversimplifies the reality of their lives. Most female gladiators were not fighting for freedom or autonomy. They were typically slaves or prisoners of war, coerced into participating in the games under threat of death. Their role in the arena was not a voluntary rebellion, but a desperate survival mechanism in a system that viewed them as little more than expendable entertainment. In this sense, the feminist myth of the female gladiator as an independent and empowered figure is anachronistic and fails to capture the full complexity of these women's experiences. Furthermore, the modern myth of the female gladiator often portrays her as a symbol of strength and courage, but this can obscure the fact that many of these women were victims of systemic violence and oppression. Their participation in the gladiatorial games was not a choice they made in the pursuit of personal empowerment, but a cruel result of their circumstances. To transform these women into paragons of freedom risks erasing the very real suffering they endured. The reality of female gladiators, exploitation and survival. The historical reality of female gladiators is far less glamorous than the modern myth suggests. These women were primarily slaves or captives, often from conquered lands, forced to fight for the entertainment of the Roman public. While some may have sought fame or financial reward, the majority were not given the option of choosing their fate. They were trained in brutal gladiatorial schools, where they were subjected to physical punishment, mental conditioning, and harsh training regimens that were designed to break them down and make them into effective fighters. Female gladiators were often seen as novelties in the games, rare and exotic attractions meant to shock and entertain the crowds. They fought in the same brutal arenas as their male counterparts, but their status in society was typically much lower. Gladiators, male or female, were regarded as little more than property. While some female gladiators may have gained fame, respect, or even freedom from their participation in the games, the vast majority of them led lives of servitude, and many of them died in the arena. The idea that these women were fighting for personal freedom is a myth that glosses over the harsh reality of their circumstances. Moreover, their participation in gladiatorial combat was often a means of survival in a society where they had few other options. Gladiators, both male and female, were frequently pushed into the arena as a way to escape worse fates, such as execution, imprisonment, or slavery. In some cases, women may have entered the gladiatorial world as a last resort, not as a way to rebel against gender norms, but as a means of gaining some control over their own survival. Feminism and the female gladiator, a double-edged sword. The feminist narrative around the female gladiator is complicated. On one hand, these women can be seen as a symbol of resistance, fighting against a system that sought to define them solely by their gender and status. By stepping into the arena, they defied Roman ideals of femininity, which placed women in passive domestic roles. They became symbols of strength and courage, challenging the notion that women were inherently weak or incapable of violence. For many modern feminists, the idea of a woman taking control of her fate in the gladiatorial arena resonates with contemporary struggles for gender equality and personal empowerment. However, this narrative also risks overshadowing the darker aspects of these women's experiences. The female gladiators were, for the most part, forced into their roles by the violent and exploitative systems of ancient Rome. They were subjected to violence, objectification, and a brutal hierarchy that gave them no real agency over their own lives. In this way, the feminist reclamation of the female gladiator can inadvertently romanticize and sanitize their experiences, focusing more on the idea of women as warriors and less on the brutal oppression they suffered. The feminist reinterpretation of female gladiators also overlooks the ways in which these women were ultimately part of a system that perpetuated violence against all those deemed expendable. While the myth of the empowered female gladiator speaks to modern feminist ideals of defiance and strength, it can also obscure the fact that these women were victims of a violent entertainment industry designed to entertain the masses at the cost of human life. The legacy of female gladiators in feminism. Despite the myths and romanticization, the legacy of female gladiators offers important lessons for modern feminism. These women, who fought against insurmountable odds, embody the resilience, strength, and will to survive that is still relevant today. They serve as a reminder that women have always had the capacity for power and resistance, even in the most oppressive and violent circumstances. The myth of the female gladiator as an empowered figure can inspire modern feminists to continue to fight against systems that attempt to limit women's freedom and agency. However, it is important to remember that the lives of these women were defined by exploitation and suffering. Acknowledging this reality can lead to a more nuanced understanding of feminism, one that recognizes the complexities of gender, power, and resistance. Feminism today does not just celebrate the strength of women, but also seeks to dismantle the systems of oppression that force women into positions of vulnerability. In this sense, the story of the female gladiator is not just one of strength, but also one of the need for societal change. Ultimately, the myth of the female gladiator in modern feminism is both empowering and limiting. It provides a symbol of resistance, but it also risks oversimplifying the true nature of the struggles these women faced. Their story is one of both defiance and oppression, and it is essential that we remember both aspects if we are to fully understand their place in history. The story of female gladiators is one that remains shrouded in mystery, but it is also one that offers a rich, complex, and thought-provoking insight into the lives of women who defied the conventions of their time. These women, who fought in the most brutal and dangerous arenas of ancient Rome, are remembered today not just for their strength and courage, but for the ways in which they represent the complexities of gender, power, and survival in a violent, male-dominated society. Throughout history, the image of the gladiator has been associated with masculinity, strength, aggression, and dominance. However, the presence of female gladiators in the Roman arena challenges this traditional notion, introducing an element of surprise, shock, and complexity into a spectacle that was already defined by violence and bloodshed. Female gladiators were rare, but they were real, and their existence speaks to the broader human experience of survival, resistance, and defiance in the face of insurmountable odds. What makes their story so compelling is that it reveals the contradictions of ancient Rome itself. On one hand, Roman society was deeply patriarchal, with rigid gender roles that confined women to domestic and passive positions. On the other hand, the very existence of female gladiators shows that Roman culture was not monolithic. These women defied the traditional gender expectations and became part of a violent public spectacle that demanded physical prowess and mental fortitude. They were both victims and heroes, subjugated and empowered, figures who lived at the intersection of violence, power, and social defiance. Despite their brutal roles in the arena, the legacy of these women has been largely forgotten or ignored by mainstream historical accounts. Their stories, which were often recorded in passing and dismissed as curiosities, have been overshadowed by the more celebrated figures of male gladiators and emperors. But in recent years, there has been a growing interest in rediscovering these women's stories, understanding their lives, and recognizing their contributions to the gladiatorial tradition. Their legacy, however, is not just one of survival. It is a legacy of resistance, of women who fought back against a system that sought to silence them and erase their stories. They were gladiators not because they sought fame or glory, but because they had no other choice. Whether enslaved, criminalized, or captured in war, these women found themselves in a position where fighting was the only way to survive. And in that fight, they left behind a legacy that is as much about defiance as it is about the survival instinct. What we know about these women is incomplete. The historical record is fragmented, and the stories that remain are often vague and unclear. We don't know exactly how many female gladiators there were or what their lives were like beyond the blood-stained arena. But what we do know is that they existed and that their participation in the games, while rare, was significant enough to be recorded in ancient texts. As we continue to uncover the lost history of these female gladiators, we are forced to confront the complexities of their lives and the ways in which they were both symbols of strength and products of oppression. In modern times, we may romanticize their struggles, turning them into icons of empowerment, but we must not forget that their lives were shaped by the same brutal systems of power and control that defined ancient Roman society. The fact that these women were able to fight, survive, and occasionally rise to fame speaks volumes about their resilience, but it also highlights the violence and exploitation that were inherent to the gladiatorial system. The enduring mystery of female gladiators is a reminder of how history often overlooks the voices of women, especially those on the margins of society. By rediscovering their stories, we not only honor their legacy, but also recognize the complexity of their lives. These women were not just warriors, they were survivors in a world that demanded the ultimate price for their entertainment. Their story, as incomplete as it may be, deserves to be remembered and celebrated. Today we can reflect on the role that female gladiators played in shaping the gladiatorial games and the legacy of ancient Rome. While their lives may not have been filled with the glory and freedom that modern feminist narratives might suggest, they represent the untold stories of women who fought for their survival, and in doing so left a mark on history that continues to resonate with us today. As we look back at their lives, we must remember that the female gladiators of ancient Rome were not just a footnote in history. They were women who lived, fought, and died under conditions that few of us can imagine. And though their stories may be incomplete, their courage and strength remain timeless, offering us an enduring symbol of resistance and survival.